Speaking of 2022, or rather 2021, it's been another eventful year in Westminster with the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, facing an endless stream of scandals. There were sleaze, lockdown parties, allegedly, and that Matt Hancock incident.
Well, one study in the Sunday Times puts Labour 8 points ahead of the Tories. But Labour leader Sir Keir Starmer's also faced problems this year. He's been criticised for being indecisive on many big issues and been forced to expel plenty of Labour members. Many now feel there's no genuine opposition. So who has had a worse year, Boris or Keir?
Joining us now is Peter Edwards, former editor of the Labour List, and Sam Collins, a senior advisor at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Good afternoon to both of you. Thank you for joining us. Peter, first of all, who's had a worse year, Boris Johnson or Keir Starmer?
Well, I want to kind of rebut the premise of your question, really. I don't think Keir Starmer's had a bad year. We'll talk about Boris in a minute, but think about Keir Starmer. He got important rule changes through his own party at Labour conference. He has had a clear message on coronavirus, and he ends the year with an opinion poll lead, quite a significant one for the first time. There's a hell of a lot more work to do if Labour is to win a general election, but I think he'll be a lot happier on January the 1st, 2022, than perhaps he was on January 1st this year.
Well, I wonder what you think about this. Is it more really a Conservative collapse, or is this a Labour resurgence?
It's a bit of both. Yeah, it's a bit of both, of course, and it's right that any leader of the opposition, they have to be opportunistic because they'll have their own agenda and they'll set out how they want the country to change. But of course, it's your job to point out where the government are going wrong and, cast your mind back 11 or 12 months. We had this indecision from Boris Johnson over what became a winter lockdown, a Christmas lockdown. We had that euphoria of getting the vaccine and then losing a little bit of ground on the rollout compared to other major economies. And then, of course, this absolute scandal over the last month or so of the secret Downing Street parties, while many ordinary folk around the country were saying goodbye to their loved ones over a tablet or over Zoom rather than being able to hold their hands in hospital. And I think you're right, it's a mixture of what the government does and how Labour responds to it. But I think everything about parties has been a Barnard Castle moment. It's cut through, people are talking about it on the bus, on the tube, and people are sickened really by what they've heard.
Sam Collins, Labour at the moment have a 7-point lead over the Conservatives. Has it been a good year for Boris Johnson?
Well, actually, I disagree with Peter. I don't think Keir's had a particularly good year. I think asking which one's had a better year this year is like asking which English batsman's done better in Australia. I mean,
nice. But there's no Joe Roots in the cabinet then.
But on the policy side, I mean, Keir has probably had a slightly better year. He's certainly, as far as I'm aware, announced more tax cuts than Boris has. 2p off the basic income tax rate, abolishing business rates, opposing the national insurance rise. I mean, these are all solid policies that any pro-enterprise government ought to be pursuing. So it's a disappointment that we haven't seen similar views from Boris. Politics-wise, losing 2 by-elections and safe Conservative seats this year has been a bit of a disaster for Boris. I suppose the one positive from his point of view will be that Labour hasn't done particularly well in the media, that they've both gone to the Liberal Democrats. So I don't really think there's a lot to write home about from either party.
Yeah, Peter, what do you make of Keir Starmer in particular? Not the Labour Party so much polling, but in particular, what do you think the public makes of Sir Keir Starmer?
Well, I think we've got to be open and admit it's maybe taken him a little while to give the public a flavour of his true personality. And I think that is now coming across. Remember, he became leader of the opposition in unprecedented circumstances, in a lockdown, not giving a speech in a cheering conference hall, but over Zoom. I think it was some point last winter, a couple of winters ago, he became leader, and we were locked down at this point, but he gave a very good party conference speech in person at the seaside in September this year. And he talked about his values, how the NHS have supported his own family, particularly his own mother. He talked about some of the campaigning work he'd done as a barrister, some of the vital prosecutions he'd done at the CPS, including involving the Stephen Lawrence case, I believe. And I really believe he conveys an image of someone who's, of course, he's upright and he's occasionally called a bit too serious or a bit too sober, but he's clearly a thoughtful guy. He's principled. He wants Labour to talk to all parts of the country.
Peter, I think that's, you could argue that, but I think people will want to know what he is offering as an alternative. I mean, what do you think he's offering as an alternative? Because I'm reading here on Wes Streeting's response about the restrictions, looking at Labour's response in full. And it says the government should publish as a matter of urgency the latest data on hospitalisations, NHS absences and so on. But there isn't any, they don't put forward what they want.
That will come nearer to a general election. Remember, you don't rush out all your policies 2 years before an election, because any good ones will be nicked and any inferior ones will be pilloried. But, you know, in a couple of words, what do you want from a leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer? What do you get? I think you get competence. He's articulate. I think you get consistency when he calls for something like a rule change or a COVID restriction. We know that he really means you should honour it. And I think you get integrity as well. And I think all those things are missing from the Prime Minister. I think the values are what's important, and the policies, and there will be hundreds of them. And people don't vote on hundreds of policies, by the way. I believe they vote on values, just one or two policies. But the policies will come as we get to manifesto time.
Polling, Peter, of most popular Labour politicians, that is those who have a positive opinion of Labour politicians, Keir Starmer doesn't even feature in the top 20, which includes Ken Livingstone, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, Andy Burnham is number one. He may have all those values you say, but he's still not cutting through with the general population.
Well, Andy Burnham's doing a great job, but it does go back to my previous answer. It's kind of about profile. And, you know, that's why I think it was very, very difficult for Keir Starmer at the start when you become leader of the opposition in a pandemic, because there's this national emergency, and quite understandably, the media and voters want to talk about this once in a 1,000-year health crisis. But I think that's why values are important. I think what we've begun to see since Labour conference in September, when he gave that very personal speech, and what you'll see over the next year is him showing that personality. And, you know, he's not just doing stuff in the House of Commons and policy. He's doing the chat shows. He's sitting on the daytime TV sofas with either your presenters or some of your rivals, and he's giving a sense of who he is as a person. And I think that's actually what people vote. And you mentioned Tony Blair and Ken Livingstone. They're two Labour politicians who've got a very distinct public image, whether you like them or not. The man or woman on the Clapham omnibus would have a clear idea of what Tony Blair is like and what Ken Livingstone is like. And that's what Keir Starmer needs to do, get his identity out there, and people will grow to like and respect him.
Sam Collins back in. Sam, what do you make of this? And also, you have said that knee-jerk COVID regulations have damaged business trust in the government. Let's bring this focus back to Boris Johnson. Explain what you mean by that and why that trust has been eroded.
Yes, of course. So having loose, open restrictions that allow the economy to work are obviously very important. But more important, I think, for a lot of businesses is being able to plan ahead, having rules that they can recognise are going to stay the same for a significant period of time and not keep bouncing around unless the government is absolutely sure that they need to change. So one of the best examples of this was the delay of Freedom Day last June. Now, that might have been necessary, but leaving it so late to announce meant that a huge amount of stock, that businesses brought in, pubs especially had brought in, then had to be completely thrown out because of the delay. So I think Boris has done reasonably well on the COVID side this year. I don't want to over-egg the pudding for him, because I think that he has been a bit willing to make changes far too quickly without waiting for real, sensible information to come through, basing it on projections rather than actual data. But he has done a reasonable job, and I think that it's when you look at how successful the UK has been over the past 6 months, especially compared to some of our European friends, then it speaks quite highly of how well he's done.
But would you not say that those decisions that he's made have been in some way undermined by the allegations and the way he's handled the allegations of these parties at Downing Street?
Oh, no question. I mean, it is, from a personal point of view, it is a completely disgraceful state of affairs for governments to be acting hypocritically. If you are the ones setting the rules, it is more important that you follow them than anybody else. If you are arresting people sitting by themselves in their cars or sitting on a park bench, then it's absolutely imperative that Downing Street should have been acting exactly the same way to exactly the same standards. I would say that leaving that aside, I think that if you're in an office all day, I don't think there was any actual danger of increasing the spread from these sort of events because, these people were in offices all day together. The idea that sitting outside having a glass of wine increased the actual risk from the virus is not, I think, very realistic. But the hypocrisy is without a doubt a major problem.
But we've had doctors and nurses in intensive care who wouldn't have been able to have sat outside and drunk wine. So I think probably... I think that's probably not going to necessarily wash with most people. There are plenty of jobs that wouldn't have been able to do so. I mean, Peter, what is your take and what's your reaction to that?
It's going to be about the perception. And I think one thing perhaps we could agree on is that voters, when it comes to polling day, aren't going to be debating the minutiae of lockdown rules. What they will remember is the perception. And the perception, in my view, completely justified, is that Downing Street staff and Tory aides broke the rules. And I'm particularly thinking of some political appointees rather than hard-working civil servants. But in the same way, voters can't necessarily, and I can't recall all the minutiae of the expenses scandal, for example, who did what and when. It's a perception that will linger. And it is a bit of an old adage, but one rule for them, another rule for the rest of us. That is what sticks in people's throat. And that's why, a bit like Dominic Cummings, this is a Barnard Castle moment. Remember Dominic Cummings and his famous eye test driving around Durham? It's that perception of a government that doesn't play by the same rules as everyone else. I think that's what will stick in people's mind. And that's actually why we've begun to see the polls change, as well as Keir Starmer setting out his own identity and values. Yeah.
Sam, just very quickly, and I mean very quickly, does Boris Johnson need to go or should he be given another chance?
Not my place to say the IEA doesn't take a point of view on those sort of things.
Right.
That's a cop-out.
Really good to talk to you. Yeah, very good. We'll leave it there then. Listen, gents, really good to talk to you. Thank you so much for speaking to us over this Christmas period, and a very happy New Year to both of you.